There we go. Go ahead.
Great. I'd like to acknowledge that the work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians, CASSA, takes place on the traditional indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the territory of Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Toronto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers.
Thank you, Cynthia. So welcome everyone to our session on a report for decent employment for South Asian immigrants in Toronto. Today, we hope to share some of the findings of our report with you that we did over the last 3 years through funding from the United Way of Greater Toronto. But again, before I do that presentation, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. And I know with the pandemic, a lot of people, have not been able to come in today to join the live session. So we are recording it to share with our colleagues and political representatives across the province and the country. And for this presentation, we do have some time at the end for you to ask any questions. So we have the Q&A enabled. We also have, you have an opportunity to raise your hands, and then we can unmute you at that point and you can ask your question live about the report, and we'll try our best to answer those questions. So before I start presenting, we do have a statement from our Member of Parliament, where our office is located in Scarborough North. Cynthia, if you just want to take a minute to read that, or part of that, to our audience today.
Sure, thank you. This is a statement from MP Sean Chan. It says, as the Member of Parliament for Scarborough North, I'm pleased to extend my warmest greetings to the attendees of CASSA's virtual forum on decent employment for racialized immigrants. I congratulate CASSA on creating such a productive space to foster discussions on their policy recommendations and felicitating the economic, social, political, and cultural empowerment of South Asians. Please accept my best wishes for a most successful event.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. Can you share your screen with the presentation? Great, thank you. So just a few seconds before I start talking about the report, a little bit about CASSA, and if you haven't been in connection with us or haven't collaborated with us in the past, just to let you know, the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians is a social justice umbrella agency. We serve South Asian communities through organizations that serve South Asians. So our mandate is regional. However, we do a lot of work nationally. So we have quite a few ongoing projects that we do on a national scale, especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been involved in a lot of national advocacy around the health and well-being of South Asian communities. As you may be aware that South Asians have been disproportionately impacted by the virus. So we've been doing a lot of that work. We've been partnering with a lot of organizations across the country to support the well-being of South Asian communities. We do a lot of policy advocacy and research work. We do some capacity building work. At this time, we have over 120 member agencies across the province. And with those member agencies, we find out what is going on the ground, what barriers communities that we serve are experiencing, and how can we work with decision makers like yourselves, if you're a political representative here or a staff of a political representative, and to work together to improve outcomes for our communities. So this project, the Moving Towards Decent Employment for South Asian Immigrants in Toronto, was was a project that was funded by United Way back in 2017. We've at the end of this month, we've kind of come to the final term of the project. It was a 3-year project, and we did a lot of community feedback and input over the first 2 years of the project through surveys and focus groups. And the third and final year, which is this year, we had intended to do a full advocacy campaign where we can engage with political representatives, with ethnic media, with social media, with the community, with employers. We had intended for it to be a little bit different than what we're doing now. We would have liked to do it in person, to have in-person meetings, and to go out and do in-person outreach. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that, but we did pivot the project a little bit to go virtually, because a lot of the content and the feedback that we received from community members in Toronto was really, really amazing. And we received a lot of great suggestions for policy level changes as well. So we wanted to take the opportunity today to talk about some of those barriers and challenges that community members expressed to us during our 2-year research period. And then we also want to talk about the policy recommendations that community members, as well as experts that have been doing work on employment equity, on decent employment, on workers' rights. We consulted with a lot of different stakeholders and experts on this particular project. So all of that culminated in this, in the reports that we released last year in October. We had the needs assessment report, and really that is kind of the meat of the project that we had. It has, the different, the feedback that we received, the different statistics can be seen in that report, and really eye-opening to see that in 2020, the research was done in 2018 and 19. In those 2 years, South Asian immigrants in the city of Toronto are still struggling to even land a decent job. So the urgency of this is critical. And we thought, given the pandemic situation, we know that people's preoccupation has been with recovering from the pandemic, with protecting people from the pandemic. But I think as we look at how do we, moving forward, how do we protect racialized communities, particularly South Asian immigrants, and support them in obtaining decent employment, this is a good opportunity window or a policy window for us to see how we can change policies and programs to be able to support our communities better. Can you go to the next slide, please? So just very quickly, just to give you an idea of how we did our research, we had 7 key informant interviews, so very lengthy interviews with stakeholders, people that have decades of experience in employment equity and decent work and workers' rights. We had 10 focus group interviews with community members, and service providers as well. And then we had over 200 email, phone, and in-person surveys. So we created surveys and translated them into various different South Asian languages. And again, this was before COVID. And so we, did online outreach. We also went into places of worship. We went into festivals and events, and we spoke to people that normally wouldn't be engaged in these kind of research studies to really get an understanding of what the challenges and barriers they're facing to gaining meaningful employment. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So just a couple of, as somebody with a research background, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the limitations so that you're aware that we are not trying to imply that just because we did a study in the city of Toronto, that it should be applicable to all cities across the country. That may not be true. However, a lot of the findings of the research could be applied to cities with similar concentration of South Asian communities in Toronto. We have Peel region, there's a lot of cities that have a high concentration of South Asians, Vancouver, Montreal. So any cities that have a higher concentration of South Asians, these findings can be applied to them. The diaspora representation. So as you may or may not be aware, the South Asian community is one of the most heterogeneous communities in the world. So we represent hundreds of different languages and cultural backgrounds and ethnicities and different countries. So we've tried our best to represent that diaspora that's here in Canada, in Toronto specifically. But again, there may be certain communities that we may have missed, but all in all, we try to engage people that come from various different backgrounds, and we try to be as inclusive as possible of all South Asian immigrants in Toronto. And finally, the other limitation was the pandemic. So in terms of the policy recommendations that we came up with, a lot of them were, again, contemplated before the pandemic hit. And now, as we were creating the policy recommendation report last year and refining it, we did take into account some of the issues that were being highlighted coming out of the pandemic. For example, sick days, mandatory sick days for racialized workers, especially. And as you may know, that racialized frontline workers have been contracting the virus at a higher rate than other community members. So some of those things we try to incorporate in the report, but it's not a report that takes into account the full analysis of the impact of the pandemic into it. So I think that is one limitation, and definitely one gap that could definitely be filled with future research. Next slide, please. So going into some of the key barriers and challenges that our participants identified, and we're seeing this now too when we talk about the resources that came out of the pandemic, the benefits, and now the vaccination. So CASSA has been involved in a lot of vaccine engagement work with the South Asian communities, and we're seeing some of these barriers, across the board for a lot of these things. So key barriers to and challenges to obtaining meaningful employment for South Asian immigrants in Toronto. Some of those included language barriers. For a lot of the participants, there was two sides of this coin. One was that people that didn't have the English capacity or the fluency or even the self-confidence to go and seek the type of employment that they were qualified for. The second was the presence of accents. And we really found that come through in a lot of the feedback that we received, that a lot of participants felt that the presence of an accent is what led them to not securing a certain employment that they had applied for. Another was, and this is something that we've been seeing for at least the last 3-4 decades, is the accreditation of skills and education. And it's not just for South Asian immigrants, it's for other racialized immigrants as well that are coming from non-European countries, where their skills and education and qualification are not accredited here in the Canadian system. Although they may be very qualified and smart and very well educated, but we have a system here that is designed to benefit people that have been living in Canada or maybe a Canadian born. So that definitely was something that popped up quite a bit. A lot of our participants that were coming from professional roles in their countries back home had a lot of frustration around trying to get accredited here in Canada. Inaccessible resources and information for employment. So so we know that there's a lot of resources being developed by all three levels of government. There's always an economic development department or division or a ministry that looks into economic development of Canadian residents. However, we found that a lot of the information that is being put out, whether it's online or if it's seminars, they're not accessible to South Asian immigrants. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be they're being held in locations that are not accessible. It could be a seminar, for example, that's held in downtown Toronto, and people living in Scarborough, Ontario, and are working full time are not able to find transit to be able to go there and attend that session. It could be that they're not linguistically accessible, so that they're offered only in English, and people that don't have strong capacity in the English language are not able to benefit from those resources. And it could be that they're in formats that are not accessible. So if they're only online, as we know that there's a lot of people here, especially within racialized communities, immigrant communities, refugee communities, that don't have access to technology or to the internet. So how do we provide them resources in a more accessible way? Lack of Canadian experience was, again, something that popped up quite a bit. And it's related to the accreditation of skills and education. So it's again, the lack of Canadian experience was a double-edged sword, as people identified it, and they said it's difficult to obtain Canadian experience when you're not able to secure employment because you don't have Canadian experience. So and it's a culture that we have in almost all workplaces, where we value Canadian experience as actual experience, and we don't value international experience. Even if we devalue it so much that we don't consider it as any experience at all. Can you go to the next slide, please? So moving onto some additional barriers and challenges. Childcare was a gender specific issue that was brought up, and it was related to a lot of the other gender specific issues that came up regarding the prosperity of racialized women and South Asian women at work. So the lack of affordable childcare definitely was a huge barrier for the participation of South Asian immigrant women in Toronto in gaining meaningful employment. So, they were forced to work in part-time jobs, or they weren't able to work at all because they weren't able to find suitable childcare. The lack of access to transportation. So definitely this was brought up by the participants that were living outside of the downtown core. And we know that concentration of South Asians in the city of Toronto are concentrated outside of the downtown core. So around North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke is where people said if they don't own a car, it's very difficult to access different workplaces in a timely manner. So a lot of times they actually rule themselves out of applying for certain positions because they simply did not have the transportation means to get there. Lack of awareness of employee rights and employer responsibilities. So we saw a bit of a gendered impact there as well. And a lot of participants said, even if the employer is violating our human rights, we don't know what they are. And how can we report our employers when we don't know what our rights are? And on the other hand, there was hesitation to report employers for fear of losing their jobs. Again, because of the lack of networks and connections to people that can support them, to organizations that can support their cases. If they didn't have that organizational support to bring a rights violation into account, they would tend not to even bother talking to their employer about it. And again, the gendered impact was that we saw a lot more South Asian immigrant women reporting this and saying that, you know, we are harassed, we are abused, sometimes we are not paid, but we're too afraid to report it. Inaccessible training and or education opportunities. So one of the things that was really brought up as something that needs as a program opportunity for us to implement for South Asian immigrants is to have training and education opportunities specifically designed to improve job outcomes, employment outcomes for South Asians. And moving a little bit one step ahead of that, having programs, training, and mentorship opportunities for South Asian women in particular, because the barriers they face are different than South Asian men. And so training opportunities and education opportunities should be reflective of that and should try to eliminate those barriers. Discrimination in hiring and promotion. So we know we've seen a lot of that over the last couple of months since the summer of 2020, where there's been a huge push by corporations to develop policies and practices of anti-racism and anti-oppression in their workplace, or diversity and inclusion, as many of them are calling it, and to look at what their hiring practices are currently looking like right now and what they should be looking like, what their leadership structure consists of, how many racialized employers have they hired, what is their promotional practices of racialized people in their workplace. So definitely we've heard from a lot of people that they face discrimination, they face microaggressions, and then a lot of them said they face outright racism in their workplace. So we know that a lot of workplaces are currently not safe places for South Asian immigrants and other racialized communities. So definitely policy changes and government action needs to happen on that front. And so the last barrier that I would just touch on very quickly is this trend where people are not very optimistic that even if there's a legislation that it would lead to any charges. So, you know, if there's any legislation to protect workers, the process is so lengthy, or it may take them a lot of resources and time, which they don't have, and it might not even lead to any changes in terms of, the employer changing their policies and programs. So people tend not to even not to even say that they're facing violations. So we will I know there's some people that have some questions. If you can hold the questions until the end, and then we will give you an opportunity to ask those. Key barriers. So a couple more barriers and challenges, just very quickly. The first one is the lack of opportunities commensurate to skills and education. So again, that's related to the point about not being accredited here in Canada. The lack of legislation to protect temporary workers and focus on temporary work instead of decent work. So we know that in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of coverage for temporary foreign workers who have had outbreaks in, for example, Windsor. There was a lot of farms where they had temporary foreign workers living in close quarters and in bunkers, and that's where a lot of the outbreaks were starting in that city. And so and that's definitely something that hasn't changed. And so a lot of the stakeholders that we consulted with said there needs to be mandatory legislation to protect temporary foreign workers, even though they're not they may not be Canadian, but they're human beings, so we need to protect their human rights. Okay, so just if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So, and I mentioned a little bit of this already. It's basically the gendered impact in the workforce. So we saw a lot of patterns and a lot of gender-specific issues that South Asian immigrant women were highlighting. So, so we found that the South Asian immigrant women that we interviewed were facing compounding barriers to securing decent employment. So it wasn't just the fact that they didn't have Canadian experience, but they faced, language barriers. They faced limited transportation. They faced the lack of affordable childcare. Technology was also a barrier for a lot of them, especially the older women that we interviewed. If they were over 50 and they were still very much open to participating in the job market, they didn't know how to apply for jobs in this current market. We're in a system where we now have LinkedIn and we have social media and we have websites and all these different employment engines for us to find employment and apply. So not having knowledge about where to go online and find those opportunities definitely was a barrier for some of the older South Asian women we interviewed. And then not being able to, if they didn't have access to resources or childcare, not being able to go out and do networking with potential employers was definitely another barrier that was highlighted. And then, like I said, it was something that really was eye-opening for us as an organization that is dedicated to gender equity. We found that female clients of the organizations that we interviewed generally faced more bullying, more harassment, and more racism than their male counterparts. So it's something that is very alarming, and we need to really pay attention to workers' rights in those situations. And just to add, this statistics, it didn't come from our report, but it comes from Statistics Canada, where they are showing the gender race wage gap. So if you're comparing the earnings of a racialized woman to earnings of a non-racialized male, the racialized woman will make 58 cents to every dollar that a non-racialized male counterpart makes for the same job. Qualifications are the same, very similar, education background is very similar, but still the white male counterpart will make $1, whereas a racialized woman in that position will make 58 cents. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then we also found, oh, the one before that. Yeah, so we also found some feedback around accessibility for people identifying with a disability in the workforce. In the South Asian community, and I'm sure with other racialized communities and other communities as well, there's a lot of stigma surrounding ability and disability. And so people informed us that they were actually too afraid to ask for any accommodation if they weren't able to participate fully in their workplace. They were fearful that they may lose their job to somebody else who was able-bodied, so for fear of losing their job, they continue to struggle in an environment that wasn't accessible for people with disabilities. Can you go to the next slide, please? So moving on to the recommendations that came out of our work, a lot of these recommendations were informed by, like I said, stakeholders that have been doing work in workers' rights and employment equity and legislation for a very, very long time. It also came directly from the clients and the South Asian community members we interviewed. It came from social service agencies that we interviewed as well, because a lot of them came, like for example, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, the Workers Action Center. They all have clients. Many of them, for a lot of them, are South Asian, and they have different complaints, and they have different rights violations that they come and seek support for. So out of all of those inputs and feedback, we created these 18 recommendations. So the full recommendations report, maybe we can, Cynthia can type it up in the chat box for everyone. And we can also email you the full recommendation and the report. It's available on our website, the entire 2 reports, the needs assessment and the recommendations. But I'll quickly go over the 18 recommendations, and then if anybody has any questions, we can get to them after I talk a little bit about the recommendations. So the first recommendation is around creating a workforce hiring strategy. So this strategy needs to be in partnership with the federal, municipal, and provincial governments, as well as employers and community partners. So one of the things that was really stressed was that employers need to be involved and community members need to be involved when it comes to creating any type of strategies or policies and programs for immigrants. So this particular strategy should be geared to hiring recent immigrants and hiring them in positions that are commensurate to their qualifications and experience. And again, this hiring strategy, so a lot of times we create strategies and we see, as advocates, that strategies come from various different levels of government, but then the implementation of that strategy and that action plan is missing. And how does this, policy document translate into actual actionable items? And what is the timeline? What are the goals? What are the indicators? What are the accountability measures? So it's important for this strategy to be wholesome in having measurable indicators, having accountability measures, including including things like pay transparency, guidelines, and employer incentives for utilizing equitable hiring practices. The second recommendation is connected to the workforce hiring strategy in recommendation 1. And that component of the strategy needs to have a component, again, that component can be built in partnership with employers and community members to have an education component to train employers. So it's something that again, we're seeing right now with the Black North organization is doing with a lot of corporations, where they are working with a lot of, large organizations and corporations to incorporate employment equity principles for Black communities. So very similarly, it would have an education component for employers that are struggling. And, I've been part of a lot of different panels and conferences and talks about how an organization can build an anti-racist foundation, how corporations can build an anti-racist foundation beyond just the typical diversity and inclusion office or diversity and inclusion officer, that one racialized person that is responsible for that entire organization, but for organizations to build that entire culture of being anti-racist and not just lived within one department, but it should be from the leadership of the different corporations and organization, and it should trickle all the way down to all ladders of that organization, and should form the culture of that organization. The third recommendation is for the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development to provide adequate services to the Office of the Fairness Commissioner to track progress of the retraining and reaccreditation process of new immigrants with an annual reporting mechanism, and with data available for the public on the employment experiences of racialized immigrants. So this was particularly brought up because we know that the Office of the Fairness Commissioner was created in 2007, but there's a lot of uncertainty around what goes on in that office, what they're doing, and how they are actually promoting the decent employment, meaningful employment for racialized immigrants. And so for this recommendation, it's asking for adequate resources to be provided to them for them to to create mechanisms where they can be accountable to the work that they do to the public. So they can say, these are our objectives, these are our indicators of success, and this is the timeline we would wish to achieve these goals, and this is what we've achieved. So a lot of transparency needs to be embedded in that office. And obviously an office without resources is just an office, and they're not able to do any work. So with this recommendation, the hope is for this office to have that capacity to do that work. Can you go to the next slide, please? Right. So this recommendation came from a lot of the settlement agencies that we interviewed. It also came from, umbrella organizations like CASSA, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, and other organizations that represent settlement agencies. For the Federal Ministry of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship should provide adequate resources to build the capacity of settlement agencies in Canada to play a greater role in providing pre-arrival resources and information to potential immigrants. So we know that we heard in our work that there's a lot of fraud going on when it comes to immigration consultants, what information that they're giving to potential immigrants, what information that they're getting, upon their arrival or pre-arrival about Canada and the prospects, the job prospects they may have. And when they come to Canada, the reality is very different. And some of the participants actually told us that their health suffered quite a bit, and their mental health suffered quite a bit in actually being hit with reality when they came to Canada, when they were thinking back home, when they were applying for immigration, that they're going to come to this land of opportunities where they come and they apply for positions that they are already qualified for, and they would get that position. It would result in a better future for themselves and their children. Whereas they come to the country and, we know the classic, the doctor being a taxi cab driver, and they're hit with that reality, and it really deteriorates their mental and physical health as well. So settlement agencies to have a greater role to advise them on the different job prospects and actually provide them a reality check that all is not well all the time. The South Asian community immigrants are struggling to find decent employment, but here are the resources and information that you need to possibly help you succeed. With that being said, I know there's a lot of systemic issues that we've highlighted and will continue to highlight that need to be changed when it comes to gaining meaningful employment and decent employment. So it's not to say just because we equip the potential immigrants or the immigrants pre-arrival with information that they're automatically, magically going to land meaningful employment. That's just one part of it. Definitely a lot of systemic issues need to change on the ground here as well. And it needs to be a collaborative effort, and many changes need to happen. So I just wanted to point it out there to say that just information on its own provided in a way that is accessible is not enough. There needs to be systemic level changes. The other recommendation is, upon arrival, the Federal Ministry of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship should expand the information and resources for landed immigrants about settlement agencies to include grassroots organizations and support groups in their community who can provide mentorship and support in the languages of the newcomers. So one of the things that we heard from especially our member agencies is that when South Asian immigrants land in Toronto, they are given pamphlets about mainstream agencies that may or may not provide services cater to that particular immigrant. They may or may not seek out that support, as opposed to giving them information about ethnic specific organizations or organizations that have great expertise in working with particular communities. So we have really amazing organizations here, like Frontline Community Services, that specializes in working with Tamil South Asians We have the Bangladeshi Canadian Community Services that supports Bangladeshi community. So, you know, those kind of organizations, they know their communities. They, you know, they have been working with them for a very long time. And so expand, so I'm not saying to not refer immigrants to settlement agencies, refer that, but expand that referral system and those resources that are provided to grassroots organizations and support groups. The other recommendation is the Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training, Skills Development should create and enforce mandatory employment equity legislation at the provincial level to coincide with the federal employment equity legislation. So this is something that is not new. You know, we have been saying this, and other organizations have been saying this for a very, very long time, that we need an employment equity legislation at the provincial level, and we need it to be comprehensive of, you know, the different types of employers, to ensure that racialized communities are can gain employment that is commensurate to their skills and education, and that they're not facing racism when it comes to hiring and promotion. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the next recommendation is the Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, in consultation with and partnership with the Ontario employers, should develop a scalable, free, mandatory on-the-job employee skill development program to enable workers to advance in the field of their work. And when we created this recommendation, we created it with it catering to racialized recent immigrants in mind, particularly to low-income groups, in particular for immigrant women, and other disadvantaged groups that can benefit from on-the-job training. So one of the things that we found, and where this is coming from, is during our research, people said, it's great that there is these training opportunities, but I work 2 jobs and I'm out of the house from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. For 7 days a week. When do I go and get these training opportunities, right? To better my skills, and to get promotions in my workplace. So we you know, this is an innovative approach, a public-private partnership between employers and government to create, for the government to resource employers to create on-the-job training for people that are struggling and are in precarious positions within their organization. They are racialized, or they're low income, or they're women, or they're part of a disadvantaged group. And, you know, they can benefit from on-the-job training because they don't have an opportunity to go outside of work to obtain training. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should update the Employment Standards Act to disincentivize ongoing short-term temporary contracts and encourage employers to develop pathways for temporary workers to be hired permanently after working for a set period of time. Obviously, this recommendation is for employers that have the capacity and resources to do so. We know that, you know, a small organization like CASSA may not have the capacity to do that, where we have 1 or 2 full-time staff, and then you know, everybody else works part-time based on contracts and at the mercy of funding from different levels of government. But when it's large corporations, when we're talking about, for example, insurance companies, looking at how they can develop those pathways and not just have temporary staff, but have pathways for those staff that have been working there for a very long time, to help them secure permanent positions. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should work with the federal government and Statistics Canada to develop new tools to collect disaggregated data, disaggregated race-based data on labor market trends that are coordinated with immigration data. So the new thing here, I know everybody's talking about disaggregated race-based data, and Statistics Canada is, you know, we've been in a lot of consultations with them, and they're working to, you know, revitalize their systems so that they can collect race-based data. And now we've seen some race-based data being collected in health as well. But this is specifically to coordinate it with immigration data so that we know, when immigrants are coming into the country, what kind of jobs that are they applying for? What kind of jobs are they securing? Is their trajectory of getting better employment changing over time? Like, are they able to get, if their salary is able to increase over time? So coordinate that data so that we can really see if policies that are being created and programs that are being created are actually working. Next slide, please. The Ontario government should work with the federal government for fair access to income support programs to provide more inclusive eligibility, to prioritize low income, newcomer, and racialized communities. So we know there's a lot of benefit programs that are disadvantageous to people that come from different immigration backgrounds or have different socioeconomic status. So in particular, eligibility criteria for different benefit programs shouldn't penalize precarious employees, for example. So a situation I can provide here to highlight what we mean by this is the eligibility criteria, for example, for EI program shouldn't penalize an employee because they haven't been able to pay enough into their EI for EI premiums because they have been working in precarious employment. So they should be able to qualify regardless of the number of required hours or the required income. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, in partnership with other ministries and levels of government, should develop a cross-sectoral support program in recognition that part of securing full-time employment requires simultaneous support in affordable housing, transit, and childcare. So that, again, stems from the research that I just highlighted. So securing employment, decent employment oftentimes is not just the matter of that employer or resources not being there or knowledge not being there or lack of networks, but it has an all-around approach is needed where we're looking at housing. So oftentimes if South Asian immigrants are in precarious housing situations, they may be underhoused or homeless or living in, with multiple other families, also known as hidden homelessness. Their prospects of being able to go out and secure employment becomes lower. Looking at how we can improve transit in areas that, for example, in Scarborough, the transit debate has been going on for a very long time in Ontario, Scarborough, Ontario. And so how can we work to build a system that works for low-income racialized communities? And then obviously I spoke about childcare quite a bit. How do we invest in affordable and accessible childcare? And childcare for all is definitely something that we support, but looking at making sure that childcare is accessible, especially to low-income racialized women. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should update the Employment Standards Act to expand the definition of employee to ensure all workers are protected under the Employment Standards Act entitlements. So that came from the fact that even in the pandemic, we saw that a lot of the benefits that were being given to people if they were considered employees, whereas if you were considered a contractor, you wouldn't have the same benefits. To protect workers that are contract workers, that a change should be made. Next slide, please. Few more, bear with us. I promise these are all really great ideas, and we're happy to work with all of you here today to see how we can support you in implementing some of these policy changes, these legislative changes, and program development. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should update the Employment Standards Act to ensure that employees in non-standard forms of employment are paid the same hourly rate as permanent full-time employees in equivalent positions proportionately. So again, that comes from the fact that if there are people that, are full-time employees, and then there's part-time employees, but they're doing the exact same work, the exact same job. Why pay the part-time employee less per hour? So if somebody's making 30 an hour as a full-time employee, but the part-time employee is being paid minimum wage, but they're doing the same thing. So it should be proportionate to the position and what is required of the position, and not discriminated based on the fact that somebody's full-time or part-time. So that was something that that came up, and I think a lot of the stakeholders that we consulted with really believe that this can elevate a lot of people out of poverty. Employers, temporary help agencies, and other intermediaries should be held jointly liable through fines and higher taxes imposed by the Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development. So this is specifically for employers that violate workers' rights. I mentioned before, one of the things that clients of agencies, community members, and the stakeholders mentioned was that people are not going to report abuse in the workplace, because if they know that nothing is going to come out of it, the employer is going to get away from it, or maybe what will happen is they will get fired from the job for a reason that may or may not be true. So so definitely need to have these fines and other penalties in place, like higher taxes for worker rights abuses. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should develop a strategy to proactively inspect workplaces as a key component of the enforcement system of the Employment Standards Act, along with the claim-based investigation of individual cases. So right now, like I mentioned, the way that the system is set up is based on claims, and claims may or may not happen. Oftentimes they don't happen. So there needs to be a two-pronged approach where there's also proactive inspections. We've seen in the pandemic that the provincial government is doing a lot of proactive inspections of workplaces to make sure that they're following protocols, they're providing personal protective equipment for their staff, and they're following provincial regulations and guidelines. Similarly, for other ESA standards, we should have a similar policy and program where they actively go and inspect workplaces. And then obviously that's connected to recommendation 14, where there's fines and other penalties in place for employers that are not doing their job properly. And finally, the final three recommendations. If you can go to the next slide, please. So the Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should implement a public provision of an extended benefits program through partnerships with the insurance companies to provide precarious workers access to extended health benefits. So we've seen, again, there's that disproportionate number of contract workers, precarious workers that are often racialized, don't have access to health benefits. And that's really, and that leads to a lot of health inequities, and I can go on a tangent about that, but I won't, because I'm already over my time for this presentation. But definitely something to consider, and to ensure that people that are in precarious employment are not able to afford their private health insurance, are supported by the government and their employers through extended health benefits. The Provincial Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development should update the Employment Standards Act to extend job-protected time off to workplaces with fewer than 50 employees and those in non-standard forms of employment. Paid leave should be proportionate to what permanent full-time employees receive. So again, we are looking at, and this is not just sick leave, this is also vacation time and other time off. It should be proportionate to what permanent full-time employees receive. It should be prorated. So if people are working part-time, and if they're working, for a shorter contract, but those number of days should still be proportionate to what full-time employees receive. The government of Ontario finally should increase the hourly minimum wage in Ontario to reflect at least the low income cutoff line to support low income workers to achieve upwards economic mobility and in some cases rise out of poverty. So right now the Ontario low income cutoff is around 38,500 annually. And so it is the least that we can do to increase the minimum wage so that people are not falling below that low income cutoff line. Next slide, please. We also have some key recommendations for employers. So I know that this forum today is for political representatives and staff of political representatives, but we also, you have some leverage with employers and may be able to push these recommendations forward. First is the development of accessible and culturally tailored mentorship programs, particularly for women. This will initiate networking and shadowing opportunities for immigrants within their fields with more experienced people. Businesses need to plan for the long term to see the benefits of having a decent wage. So equal pay for equal work should be implemented, not just for gender, but also to close a race-based wage gap, which I spoke about earlier with the 58 cents to $1. Workers should be given paid sick days. So there's been a lot of advocacy around this recently. We have actually found, to go off into a tangent just for 30 seconds, is that especially South Asian workers in precarious employment, if they're getting sick with COVID, or if they're just getting sick and they have symptoms, they're too afraid to tell their employers, because that would mean that they would need to take time off work, and that would mean that they're not receiving an income for that time that they're taking off. So who would feed their families and who would take care of their expenses during that time? So some of them are not reporting symptoms, some of them are not getting tested because of that, because they have fear that they don't have paid sick days, and if they take time off, then it will really have a negative impact on their financial well-being. So definitely in the COVID context, this is a huge one. This can lead to, and it says here, it can lead to greater profit too for organizations. But I think in this context, we shouldn't even be looking at profit, but looking at people's health and well-being. But if we're looking at profit, if we have staff and employees that are healthy and they're not making other employees and staff sick, that will lead obviously to greater profitability for that corporation or organization. Next slide, please. So some of very quick suggestions from the participants. Again, a lot of them talked about affordable childcare. Some participants mentioned having a temporary tax bracket for newcomers, so that when people newly arrive to the country, there should be some more tax savings for the newcomers so that they can use the money that they're saving from lower taxes to build better, whether it's like buying housing, or they're able to make mortgage payments, or able to seek education and training using the money that they're saving early on, as they're recent immigrants in Canada. Culturally appropriate mental health supports for immigrants was something that was mentioned as well. And I mentioned in my presentation that having to go through that process of envisioning your experience in a country as being very positive, and then coming to Canada and a lot of times having the very opposite experience, it leads to a lot of mental health challenges and physical health challenges. Can you go to the next slide, please? Alrighty, so that's the end of my presentation. Apologies, I spoke for about 15 minutes. So just very quickly, wanted to add, and I mentioned this earlier on as well, In the 1980s, in 1988 to be specific, CASSA was founded on the principle of supporting South Asian immigrants with credential recognition. That was kind of our founding issue as an organization. And it's been over 3 decades that CASSA's been here. We've, developed, and we are now working on various different issues to support the communities, but credential recognition is still there. We still have not achieved full, participation of South Asian immigrants communities, unfortunately. Strides have definitely been made, but there's still a lot of South Asian immigrants that are truly struggling. So thank you so much. And we do have an opportunity now to ask for you to ask questions. So there's 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can either, so Cynthia, you can stop sharing the screen. You can either ask in the Q&A or the chat box, or you can raise your hand and then we will unmute you and then you can ask your question. So I know Counselor Cynthia Lay has a question, so I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, thank you so much for the nice presentation and all the good work that CASSA has been doing for the community. I just have a quick question. This report, has it been already sent to the federal government, to different governments, or are you working on the final version, or how does that work? What stage are you at?
We've completed the report. In the invitation email that we sent for this particular webinar, we included links for the reports. So both the needs assessment report and the policy recommendation report should be in that email. We can also type it up in the chat.
No,
Cynthia,
this is not what I'm asking. I'm asking for, has this report been submitted?
Yes, it has.
That was my question. So
yeah,
when was it submitted?
We had submitted back in October. We had contacted, Cynthia's been contacting people for the last 6 months now. So between October and now, both reports have been submitted to all 3 levels of government, different ministries. It has been submitted to different city-related political representatives, as well as the provincial government.
Yeah, I think I have a further question on that one. So it's been submitted 6 months now. Has there been any actions on any of your recommendations? Are there any follow through? I mean, have some of these recommendations that you've proposed been implemented?
So we haven't had any actions on these. With that being said, we have our advocacy campaign extends, and we're doing a lot of these webinars and things like that. So, and also with the pandemic, a lot of the ministries that we contacted weren't able to provide their attention at this time. But we're hoping that we'll continue to advocate for the recommendations that we've put out. But as of the last 6 months, not that I know of.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are my questions. And if I may have just one comment, this is a very good report and very comprehensive. And I think you are just focusing on for racialized immigrants. That means that any kind of racialized immigrants, including Asians, South Asians, East Asians. So is that what this report is all about? It's not just for South Asians. Is that correct?
That's correct. So the needs assessment report is specifically from the South Asian community that we consulted with, whereas the policy recommendations support, we made it more broadly to racialized immigrants, because as we were speaking to stakeholders, they said these recommendations could be applied broadly to all racialized immigrants in Toronto.
Yes, I just wanted to confirm to you the fact that I think the report is very comprehensive, as I said, and I think it applies to the other part of the Asian community,
Yeah.
including the East Asian, because being in the East Asian myself, I think East Asian Canadian, I would say, I think a lot of these things would apply same to those, well, we call them racialized immigrants. I think it's
Right,
very,
for sure.
very interesting. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, good
Yeah,
job.
and
Good job.
thank you so much. And if you take a look at the policy recommendations report, we highlight that in the introduction, that although our research was done specifically for South Asian immigrants, we believe that the recommendations can be applied to all racialized immigrants.
Great, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great job.
Any other questions? So there's a question in the chat here. Can you say more about the need for training targeted to the needs of South Asians? How would these be different from the programs for other immigrants? How might these be structured to avoid perception of discrimination against other ethnic groups? So one of the biggest things is looking at the language barriers, I think, was one of the biggest things that came up when it came to training. Looking at how we can provide training to South Asian community members in languages that they can understand. Obviously, it takes time to be able to learn English and to be fluent in English with time and practice. But if we're providing training for recent immigrants, and that training is fully in English, and it's not going to be accessible for people that from South Asian communities that are not fluent in English or don't have the fluency yet. So, that kind of language, South Asian language specific training, whether it be in Urdu or Tamil or Punjabi or Bangla, that would be catering towards South Asian immigrants. The other thing that I would say is the cultural component of living in different South Asian households may be very different from how other racialized immigrants may live. So obviously we don't have all the answers for all racialized immigrants right now to see what kind of training they would benefit from. But doing that in consultation with those communities to see what are their needs, what are some of the barriers they're facing. For example, some of them may be living in a multi-generational household where they have responsibilities not just for childcare, but also for care for their elderly parents. So again, that would be a barrier for them to seek employment and secure decent employment. So what are some ways that we can provide them training? How can we structure the training hours so that they have somebody else available at that time to care for their responsibilities while they go and attend the training? How can we provide that training in an accessible location and format so that people that have that kind of family structure are able to participate? So that's what we meant by training that is targeted to the needs of South Asians, and not just for South Asians. Like Councillor Cynthia Lay mentioned, the recommendations of this report could be applied to other racialized immigrants. So then how, for East Asian immigrants, how can we build training sessions to be able to promote their well-being and their employment outcomes? And there's there's a lot of programs and policies that are being developed to correct historical racism and discrimination and inequities and harms that have been created. So instead of looking at it as discrimination against other groups, non-racialized or racialized group, we should look at it as a way for us to seek equity. And equity doesn't really mean giving everybody the same kind of programs and training and services, but it means looking at what the needs are of the different communities and creating programs and services for those. So it wouldn't be discrimination against other ethnic groups. There should be programs and training created for those groups as well. So as CASSA, and if you know our organization, we have been an organization that is in solidarity with other racialized communities, with Indigenous communities and Black communities, and we support the advancement and well-being of those communities as well. A question here, have you thought about sharing the report with other Asian agencies such as CICS? I'm going to defer that question to Cynthia, who's been kind of at the head of sharing this report with, like hundreds of organizations and individuals. So Cynthia, do you want to answer that question? Have we shared the report or are we planning to share the report with other organizations like CICS?
For sure. Thank you for your question. We have been sharing this report from about October now, and we've reached out to almost, I think, about like 80 other advocacy agencies. We've reached out to groups and clubs and universities. Right now, we're also going to be reaching out to businesses, small and large, and we reached out to government entities, ministers, and all as well. But of course, I mean, we're always open to reaching it out to even more people that we haven't been able to reach. So if you have any idea of who else we can reach out to, please let us know, and we're happy to circulate our report.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? So I don't think there are any other questions, but so this, like I said, this webinar is recorded. What we will do is we will share the webinar with all of you if you want to pass it on to your colleagues. If you have connections in other ministries and departments and divisions in all 3 levels of government, feel free to share. And we will also, we have had quite a few regrets from a lot of colleagues and political representatives who weren't able to make it, but we will make it a point to send it out to those colleagues as well, so that they have access to this information. Okay, thank you once again. We are ending a little bit early, but we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.